Okay, so welcome to the second session of this retreat on knowing the mind. So let's just spend a little bit of time sitting quietly, and you can pay attention to the breathing, aware of the breath coming in and going out, or if you have experience with the meditation on the nature of the mind or mindfulness meditation, you can do one of those. Something to settle the mind, not be thinking about things. So when we do meditation on the breathing, paying attention to our breath flowing in and out, we are experiencing the breath as sensations in our body, either sensations around the nostrils where the air is coming in and going out of the body, or sensations in other places such as the abdomen or the chest, which is moving with each breath, each inhalation and exhalation. So that's how we know that we're breathing, how we observe our breathing, by the sensations in our body with the breath coming in and going out. So those sensations are the objects of mind awareness. So see if you can pay less attention to the object, those sensations, and instead try to become more aware of awareness itself, that which knows, that which experiences, that which feels, whatever you want to call it, the sensations of the breath coming in and going out. It's not easy to do, but it's good to at least try to be aware of awareness itself. And remember what was said this morning about the nature of mind, that it's something non-material, non-physical, not made of particles, not having any physical properties at all. And it's that which is aware. That's what it does. Its job is to simply be aware. Just spend a few minutes trying to be aware of awareness itself. The awareness that is aware of the breath, the sensations in the body as the breath is coming in and going out. And when we try to be aware of awareness itself, we may also become aware of a sense of an I, a sense of I who is aware, almost like something behind or beneath the awareness. Like I feel, I know. So if you do happen to notice that sense of I, that's actually something extra. And in fact, according to Buddhism, it's not really there. It's imaginary. There's no additional I who is aware. There's just awareness itself. That's all there is. That's all that's needed, is just awareness itself without something extra, an I who is aware. So if you do happen to notice that I who is aware, you can ignore that. Just try to be aware of awareness itself. So that's something you can try on your own sometimes when you're having some experience, whether it's a perception, seeing, hearing, smelling, feeling, or thoughts, thinking, feeling, emotions. Just see if you can pay less attention to the object that is being experienced and try to turn your attention inwards to the experience itself, the mind itself. But like I say, it's not easy. I find it hard. Okay, so there were a couple of questions that came up after this morning session. So one question says, you mentioned it is not possible for our minds to merge with another's mind. So in Guru Yoga, the practice of merging your mind with your guru is purely symbolic. So Guru Yoga is a practice usually found in Tantra, Vajrayana Buddhism. And to do that kind of practice, you first receive an empowerment and teachings, and you're practicing under the guidance of a teacher. Yeah, so when you're doing that kind of practice, there's usually some visualization, like visualizing a deity, Tara or Chenrezig, and thinking that this deity and your guru are one, inseparable. And then at a certain point, you imagine the deity dissolving into you and meditate on yourself being, they do use words like one and inseparable, but that, my understanding is that isn't meant to be taken literally. It's not that you and the guru really literally become one, or your minds become one, but rather it has to do with emptiness. Because when you do this kind of practice, ideally, you have an understanding of emptiness, the lack of inherent existence of all phenomena. So you yourself are empty of inherent existence. Your mind is empty of inherent existence. Your teacher, your guru, also empty of inherent existence. The deity, empty of inherent existence. So you ideally have an understanding that all of you are, and all other phenomena are empty of inherent existence. And emptiness, so emptiness is the ultimate truth, the actual way everything exists. And it said that the emptiness of one thing and the emptiness of another thing are not really different, in the sense that they are like one taste. In the same way that if you have a bag of sugar consisting of many little grains of sugar, but all the grains of sugar have the same taste. They all taste sweet. So it's not that one tastes one way and another tastes another. They all have the same taste. So in a similar way, emptiness, the emptiness of every single phenomena has the same taste. It has the same nature. And so the emptiness of your mind and the emptiness of the guru's mind and the emptiness of the deity's mind all have the same taste. So that, I think that's what you're supposed to be thinking and meditating on when you imagine the deity coming into you, and the guru, the deity coming into you, and imagining the experience of emptiness, or understanding the experience of emptiness if you already have that realization. So it's a way to enhance your understanding, your experience of emptiness, which is an essential part of tantric practice. Yeah, so it doesn't mean literally two minds or more than two minds merging and becoming one mind. And there were a couple of other questions that were about the relationship of mental consciousness and sense consciousness. And I prefer to leave those until later because I have more to say about mental consciousness and sense consciousness. So let's look at that material first, and then I'll leave those questions until later. And if there are other questions as well, we can bring those up later. So we left off in the middle of a slide that starts at the top. The heading is, how does the mind arise? So here we're looking at the causes and conditions for a mind to arise. And in case you're wondering, why do we need to know this? It is helpful, just as, if we want to make something, like we want to make a cake or we want to make a woodshed, you have to know how to do it. What are the materials, the ingredients to put together, and how to put them together in the right way so you get the desired result, the desired product. So it's kind of similar with our mind in the sense that in Buddhist practice, the real goal is to attain certain states of mind, ultimately a mind that's fully enlightened, fully awakened. And then there's, of course, lots of other states of mind we need to achieve on the way. And those states of mind don't just happen by chance or praying to Buddha, please give me that realization. I want that realization. And somehow Buddha's going to put it into our minds. Instead, we have to create the causes and conditions. There are causes and conditions that bring about those states of mind. Even Buddha's mind, enlightened mind, that came about because of many causes and conditions. Yeah, so it is important to understand that that's how the mind works. It arises from causes and conditions. And when we don't know about the mind, we don't know how the mind works and what kind of causes and conditions give rise to certain states of mind, then we're more helpless. Then we're just kind of at the mercy of our karma and things that happen to us and so on and so forth. But the more we understand how the mind works, then the more choice we have, the more control we have over what kind of things arise in our mind. Does that make sense? So I think it's useful, practical, not just intellectual knowledge. So this morning we looked at the causes of a sense consciousness, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and body consciousness, tactile sensations. So there's mainly those three conditions. And then a mental consciousness is a little different. It has an object. It always has an object. So there is an object, which is, one of the conditions of a mind. But in the case of a mental consciousness can have a great variety of different objects. So in a way, it's much more extensive or expansive than sense consciousnesses, because each of the 5 sense consciousnesses is limited to its own kind of objects. Eye consciousness can only see shapes and colors, but not sounds or smells. And hearing consciousness, ear consciousness can only hear sounds, but not tastes or smells or shapes and colors. So each of the 5 sense consciousness is limited. It's only able to perceive or experience a limited number of objects, whereas the mental consciousness can experience any of those 5 objects. A mental consciousness can know all 5 of the sense objects, colors and shapes and sounds and smells and so on. So those can be objects of mental consciousness. Now you may wonder, how is that possible? It happens all the time. Because what usually happens is we first perceive an object, we see something or hear something or smell something, and very quickly our mind starts thinking about it. We start conceptualizing about it, whether we're aware of it or not, but our mind starts having thoughts. I mean, even just to give it a name, just to say, that's red, or that's the smell of a rose, or that's the taste of pizza, or whatever, you know, that kind of, that's conceptual activity, and that's mental consciousness, not sense consciousnesses. They don't give names to things. I think our mind, the way I understand it, our mind kind of switches back and forth between perceiving an object with our five senses and then thinking about it, conceptualizing about it, and then going back to the object and then thinking, and so on and so forth. So whenever we're thinking about an object, even if we're still looking at it or hearing it or smelling it, there can still be thoughts going on at the same time. And those are mental consciousnesses, and they do know the same objects that our sense consciousnesses know. So mental consciousness can know, and also another example is remembering, having memories of things. So, we do that all the time as well. So if you're away from home, for example, you can think about your home and all the details of the place where you live and all the people who were there and so on and so forth. So anytime we have memory, remembering experiences that we had before, this is also mental consciousness. Yeah, so a lot of these just pop up spontaneously, just these memories of objects that we've seen and heard and so on. They'll just pop up, especially when we're trying to meditate. We don't want them to be there. They keep coming up. Have you noticed that? But sometimes we may deliberately bring to mind experiences that we had in the past. For example, if you're on the witness stand in a trial and the lawyer is asking you, on the night of May 1st, when such and such crime was committed, where were you? And what did you see? And what did you hear? And what did you smell? So then we're on the spot to have to bring up those memories of our perceptions on that occasion. And also in our meditation, and when we do analytical meditations and we're trying to understand a particular topic, for example, suffering or dukkha, it's really helpful to bring to mind past experiences that we've had of dukkha and get a deeper sense and a greater sense of the pervasiveness of dukkha, of suffering in our lives and in the lives of others. So, meditating on the kindness of sentient beings. We bring to mind experiences where other people gave us things, food and so on, that we needed and enjoyed, or treated us with kindness when we were sick and so on. So it's very helpful to be able to bring to mind those past experiences. It enhances our meditation practice, enhances our ability to cultivate these positive states of mind, like loving kindness and wanting to repay the kindness of others. So this is mental consciousness, experiencing objects of our five senses that we experienced before in the past. And then there's fantasies. Our mind will sometimes create elaborate fantasies or plans, things we want to do later, or experiences that we hope will happen, and so on. So all this involves mental consciousness. And there are also objects that are exclusive to mental consciousness and not experienced by any of the senses. For example, emptiness. This is one of the most important objects we need to understand and eventually realize, experience. That's the wisdom realizing emptiness is the antidote, the remedy to all our suffering. So it's a very, very important object to learn about and eventually understand and realize. And that's something that cannot be perceived by any of our five senses. It's a non-physical, non-material thing. So it's only possible to know emptiness with mental consciousness. Other examples of mental objects that can't be known by our senses would be abstract composites. This is the third type of impermanent phenomena, which include, impermanent phenomena that are neither form nor consciousness. So an example is time, or any division of time, like minute, hour, day. I'm pretty sure that's something that can't be known by any of our five senses. So it's only with our mental consciousness that we're able to know such a thing. And also dream objects, the things that we see in our dreams, which can sometimes be incredibly vivid and complex and interesting and so on. So while we're asleep and dreaming, we're just totally caught up in that whole story. And then as soon as we wake up, it disappears and we're there in our bedroom with our furniture and all these boring things. So all those interesting dream objects disappeared. So they are only experienced by the mental consciousness. So anyway, I'm just trying to point out that mental consciousness has a vast variety of different objects.
A person is an abstract composite.
Mm-hmm.
Can a person only be known by a mental consciousness?
Yeah, I've heard some discussion about that. And what I remember, I could be wrong, but they do say that perhaps it's because if we get very familiar with a particular person, like our mother or father or sister or brother, then just with our sense consciousnesses, seeing, for example, we can just, our eye consciousness can know that person, can know them. Maybe it's something like that, but I'm not 100% sure. It's probably a topic of discussion and different opinions and debate. Yeah.
I would think the person can only be known by a mental consciousness because the person is not the body we see. It's imputed by a mental consciousness on the body, on the aggregates. So anything that's imputed is imputed by the mental consciousness. So I would think what you first said is true.
Yeah, and I seem to recall something just recently about how it's inference that knows abstract composites. Did somebody else hear that? Did that come up in a teaching with? I think so, in that book. Yeah. We're going to get to inference tomorrow. What inference is, how that works. But yeah, I agree. A person is not really something that's visible. We can see a person's body, we can hear a person's voice, we can smell them. So by those clues that are perceivable by our senses, we can know, oh, that's so and so. But yeah, maybe it is more inference. That's an inference that knows the person. So it does seem a bit strange to say a person can be perceived by the five senses. But I don't know. I'm still very much a student of this topic, not a master. Okay, so there's an object, and that's one of the conditions to have a mental consciousness. And then the second one is called the mental power. And the mental power is not any of the five sense powers, but it's the previous moment of mind, or consciousness, whatever that was. It could be any of the six consciousness, whatever was there before, just before that mental consciousness arises. That is the mental power, and transforms into the mental consciousness. And the third condition is the same, actually. It's also the previous moment of mind. The reason they're differentiated, we still say there's only two conditions. There's the object and the previous moment of mind. But the previous moment of mind is still given two slots here because technically there are terms for these three different conditions. So number 2 is called the dominant condition. Number 3 is called the immediate condition. And in the case of a sense consciousness, they are different. They're different things. But in the case of a mental consciousness, the dominant condition and the immediate condition, number 2 and 3, are the same thing. It's the previous moment of mind. So we have a previous moment of mind and an object, and when those come together, then a mental consciousness will arise. So mind is dependent. This is important to understand. For example, like I mentioned before, we want to know what are the causes and conditions to bring about states of mind so that we can try to have more of the desirable states of mind, the positive states of mind, and less of the negative states of mind, the disturbing ones. So it is helpful to know what are the causes and conditions, but it's also helpful to know from the point of view of emptiness. If we're using the reason of dependent arising to understand emptiness, then we look at phenomena and how they are dependent on other things for their existence. Without those causes and conditions, that phenomena wouldn't exist. So looking at how mind depends on its causes and conditions helps us understand that the mind is not something inherently, independently, objectively existing. But that's not our topic for now. We're not going into emptiness, but in other contexts, to understand emptiness, then we look at the dependent arising of things like the mind. The next slide gives some different terms for mind. I thought to show this because people sometimes get confused. That, in Buddhist texts, Buddhist teachings, they use so many different terms: mind, consciousness, awareness, cognition, realization. It is confusing, I agree. So I'm not going to explain all the terms, but there are 3 terms that all have the same meaning. They're 3 different words, but they're all synonymous or equivalent. And I put the Tibetan there because unfortunately, when you have different books, different texts, the translators use different English terms for the same Tibetan term. So if you're looking at 2 different books and you see a term used, it might actually be the same term in Tibetan, but the translator is translating it differently. So that's why I think it's very helpful to know at least some Tibetan, some Tibetan terms, so you can go back to the Tibetan and say, oh, that's what they're talking about. But you do have to have some understanding of what that word means. So the Tibetan word lo, if they put it in phonetics, this is phonetics. Phonetics is lo, but if they put it in, what's it called, Wiley script? Like the actual Tibetan letters, it's usually BLO, but the B is silent. So that's why I left the B off. It's not blow, it's low. Yeah, that's one of the words for mind. So here I'm translating it as mind, but some translators translate it as awareness. And they basically have the same meaning in Tibetan. It's that which is clear and knowing, clarity and awareness. Okay, that's kind of a general term for mind. And then another term in Tibetan is rikpa. But rikpa is also very tricky because in our Geluk tradition, rikpa has one meaning. It's just another word for mind. So every mind is a rikpa. Whereas in Dzogchen tradition, which I haven't really studied, so I'm not qualified to talk about it, but they use the word rikpa for something else. I think it may even be clear light mind, if I'm not wrong. So it has a different meaning. So in our tradition, rikpa simply means, again, knowing or cognizing. Those are different translations that are sometimes used. A knower or a cognizer. An instance of mind, an instance of awareness, an instance of knowing. And then the third term is consciousness, or shepa in Tibetan. And again, that's equivalent. It's not something different from mind. It is mind. It's just another name, another term for mind. So this can be confusing in the beginning, but if you just get familiar, with these different terms and know that they are interchangeable, then you can be more flexible with them. So all of these three terms are the same. They all have the characteristics of clarity and awareness. They all refer to what's happening inside of us that knows and experiences and perceives and so on and so forth. So next I would like to go into another way of categorizing or dividing mind. And this is into two, perception and conception. So every instance of mind, every instance of experience we have is one of these two. Nothing can be both. There's nothing which is both perception and both conception. They are very different. So we'll look at what they are and how they are different. Starting with perception. Next slide is perception. And perception is also called non-conceptual mind. In fact, that's the usual term you come across in the texts. They don't usually say perception. They say a non-conceptual mind that da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So to really understand perception, we have to have some understanding of conception. But anyway, we'll do one at a time. So in general, these are minds that directly perceive an object rather than through the medium of a mental image, which is what happens with conception. So the main difference between perception and conception is that perception experiences an object directly, and they even use the word nakedly. It has this direct, naked contact or experience with the object. On the other hand, conception, for example, when we think about an object, that mind, the conceptual mind, doesn't contact the object directly, nakedly. Instead, it knows its object through a mental image. Although there's different terms for mental image. Venerable uses conceptual appearance, I think. And the term, and a kind of precise translation of the term from Tibetan is meaning generality, which I always hated. What does that mean? But that's like a literal translation. So you do come across that term sometimes in texts, the meaning generality. I just like mental image. It just seems more, makes sense to me. So it's an image of the object that it appears like the object, but it's not. So, for example, if we think about a person, let's say we think about our father. Tomorrow's Father's Day, apparently. So some of you might still have your father alive, but many of us don't. But we can still think of our father. Even though our father may not be alive anymore, we can still have a mental image, a mental picture of our father. So if you close your eyes and think of your father, then there'll be some kind of picture there in your mind of your father. So that's a mental image or a conceptual appearance. And it's said that when we have a conception or a thought of a person or any object, there's this mental image which looks like the actual object, although it isn't. And the conceptual mind is not able to know or not able to tell that that isn't the actual object. Conceptual minds are kind of fooled into thinking that is the real object. And you may have doubt about that. You may think, no, if I think of my father and I have a picture of my father, I know that's not my father because he died so many years ago. So that's another mind that thinks that. But the conceptual mind itself that is, experiencing that object isn't able to know that, that's not the real object, it's just an image. Now, as proof of that, you can probably think of times when you thought of a person, let's say somebody you dislike, somebody you're angry at, somebody who may have done something really annoying or really hurtful. And that person may be somewhere else. And you think of that person, a mental picture of that person comes up, and you get angry. Have you ever had that happen? You can get really, really angry. So to me, that shows that it's as if that person is really there right in front of you, as if you're looking at them and that anger comes up towards them. So I don't know, to me that's how I understand this, this idea that conceptual mind is unable to distinguish the image of the person or object from the actual one, because we can still get very emotional just by having that mental image of the person. And then, yeah, another mind can say, no, wait a minute, that person you're thinking about isn't here, and maybe they're not even alive anymore. So why are you getting all worked up? But that's another type of mind that's thinking about that. And the same with desire, with attachment. If you think of an object of desire, a really attractive person, or a really delicious food that you would like to eat, your mouth can even water, isn't it? As if that food is right there waiting to be tasted, waiting to be eaten. Yeah, so mental images really can be quite powerful and appear like the actual thing, to the extent that we can have other emotional responses towards them. Yeah, so we'll get into conception afterwards and look more about that. But so a perception is not like that. It's not like a conception. A perception is dealing directly with the actual object. So that means the object has to be nearby, especially visual, to have a visual perception. No, I guess that's not true. We can see the moon. That's how far away. And the stars, they're even further away than the sun. Yeah, so yeah, certain objects, big ones and bright ones and so on, don't have to be so close in order to see them. Yeah, so with seeing, we can actually see things that are far away. And hearing, if it's a really loud noise, that can also be quite far away and we can still hear it. But if it's a soft noise like a whisper, we have to be very close to be able to hear it. Smells have to be quite close. Well, that's not true either. Yeah, fires in California. But then we're not smelling the fire in California. We're smelling the smoke that blew here from California. Yeah, so it's the smoke that's present that we are able to smell. But yeah, I think odors also generally need to be pretty close to know them, and taste even closer, right? We can only taste something if it's right in our mouth. We can't taste it if it's, even a few inches away. And then bodily sensations, that also has to be very close, right here in our body, directly contacting. So anyway, with perceptions, with our five senses, the object needs to be accessible, nearby, or at least visible and not hidden by other things and so on. Yeah, there has to be this direct connection between our mind and the object. It has to be fairly close by. And perception is actually a better way of experiencing objects because objects appear much more clear and vivid. Yeah, you can try that yourself. Just like look at an object with your eyes and then close your eyes and think about that object. Try to visualize it. And then compare how it appears when you're looking at it and how it appears when you're just thinking about it. And you'll probably see, yeah, thinking about it, it's kind of more fuzzy and I can't see all the details. Whereas looking at it is much more vivid, clear, and more details are appearing. So generally, perception is of a more, I don't know what to say, complete, maybe clear and vivid experience than conception. And there are 6 kinds of perceptions for each of our 6 senses. So the first 5 we've already talked about: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body. Now, mental perception, this is a kind of mysterious one, because probably most of our mental experiences are conceptual rather than perception. So what is mental perception? That's when our mind is directly, nakedly contacting an object. There's a few examples of this that are given, but there are things that most of us don't experience. One is sometimes it's called clairvoyance or super knowledge, that is able to see another person's mind. So some people may have this ability naturally. Other people gain it through developing samadhi, calm abiding. And then on top of calm abiding, you do other kind of practices, and you can gain this ability to see other people's minds. So that's a direct perception, a mental direct perception, because another person's mind is not a physical object. It's not an object of the 5 senses. It's only an object of the mental consciousness. So someone who has that ability, can look into your mind, see your thoughts, and that's a mental direct perception. Other examples are realizations achieved by yogis, meditators, through practicing meditation on certain objects such as emptiness, impermanence, subtle impermanence. So I'll talk about this more later, but at some point they gain a mental direct perception of that object, a mental direct perception of emptiness or of subtle impermanence. They actually call it a yogic direct perception, because it only comes about through very intense meditation. So again, that's an experience probably most of us haven't had. We can talk about it and try to understand it. But they also do say that there is a kind of mental direct perception that everybody does have. But again, it's something we don't notice because it's so brief. They say that in between perception, like a sense perception, seeing an object or hearing an object, and then before conception kicks in and starts thinking about it, there's a very brief moment of a mental direct perception of that object. So if I see this blue thermos, and before I start having conceptions about it, even saying this is a blue thermos, there's a very brief moment of a mental direct perception where it's just mental consciousness perceiving the thermos, and then goes into conception. So they say it's so short we don't notice it, but it happens. So those are the 6 kinds of perceptions that people can have. The first 5 are sensory, and the 6th is mental consciousness. So that's it for perception. Well, we will come back to it later, but I'm just trying to point out here the difference between perception and conception. So conception, the next slide is about conception. We could also call this thought, thinking, thoughts, those are conceptions. So conception only takes place in the mental consciousness. None of the 5 sense consciousnesses are ever conceptual. So only the 6th, mental consciousness. And they do not directly perceive their object. Instead, they know their object via this mental image, or also called meaning generality or conceptual appearance. And the mental image appears like the actual object, and conception is not able to tell the difference. And for that reason, conceptions are said to be always mistaken. All conceptions are mistaken because of that mistake, that they can't tell the difference between the actual object and the image of the object that appears to them. I'm always somewhat mystified by these mental images, where they come from, how they arise, because they're said to be permanent. And permanent means they don't arise from causes and conditions. So how do they arise? Maybe like a side effect of a conception, that they come together with the conception. I'm not completely sure, but somehow they're produced by the mind, but not really produced because they're permanent. So, yeah. Has anyone heard any explanation about that? I tried to ask Geshe once, and he said it was so long ago that he studied Lorik, he couldn't remember. So he wasn't able to give me a satisfying answer. But one thing they do say too, which is pretty mind-boggling, is that when we have a conception of an object, this mental image represents the opposite of everything in the universe that isn't that object. Meaning that it's almost like the mind goes through a process of elimination, eliminating everything else that isn't that object, and what's left over is that mental image. So don't ask me how that works, but that's what they say. So thinking of cow, for example, the mind will eliminate non-cow. Non-cow is whatever isn't a cow. And what's left over after eliminating non-cow is cow. But it's just an image, a mental image, this meaning generality. But like I say, I don't fully understand that, but that's what they say. So it's baffling how conception works. Okay, so all conceptions are mistaken. And in addition, some conceptions are also wrong. So the next slide is looking at wrong conceptions, but also wrong perceptions. So some of our conceptions and some of our perceptions are wrong. So what does it mean to be wrong? First, what does it mean to be right or correct? So again, conceptions are always mistaken because they are mistaken to what appears to them. What appears to them appears like the actual object, although it isn't. However, even though they're mistaken, they can still be correct. There's these different terms in Tibetan between mistaken and wrong and correct. So a correct conception is one that apprehends its object correctly, as it is. For example, thinking that a rope is a rope, or thinking that sound is impermanent, or thinking that, the Dalai Lama is a wonderful person. So if they are correct about the object and they don't have some kind of distortion about the object, then they're correct. So some are correct, but some are wrong. So examples of wrong conceptions would be thinking that a rope is a snake. Probably most people here are familiar with that example, but those who are not, this is an example that comes up in usually in the Madhyamika teachings. And it's something that can happen, that if we're in a place where it's dark, maybe the sun has already gone down and it's getting darker, and so it's difficult to see things clearly, and we're outside. If we see this object that's actually a rope or a hose coiled up, round up, and it's got markings on it, stripes or diamonds or whatever, diamonds. So we see that, and our mind might think it's a snake. It can look like a snake, and we might think that it's a snake. So this probably did happen to someone, and that's where that example came from. There's no snake there. Snake is just something appearing to our mind. It's a wrong conception. So what we're seeing is actually a rope. That's what's actually there. But our mind, our conceptual mind, is saying it's a snake. And then we can get frightened and upset about that. Another example is thinking that sound is permanent. So the source of that one is a non-Buddhist school, an ancient non-Buddhist school. I don't remember their name, but they have this belief that the Vedas are some very ancient, holy scriptures that probably existed forever, that they are permanent. So this school believes the sound of the Vedas is permanent. And the Buddhists, reject that. They say there's no such thing as permanent sound. So they probably had debates in the old days with the believers in this view and tried to prove to them that no sound is permanent. Sounds are created by causes and conditions. They change. They're very impermanent. I mean, the sound may be there for a while and then it goes away. So it's obviously not permanent. But still, these people, the followers of this particular school, had this view, this conception. The sound, maybe particularly the sound of the Vedas. Maybe they didn't think this about other sounds, but the sound of the Vedas is permanent. So that's an example of a wrong conception. And we'll talk more about this later. We all have wrong conceptions, but often we don't notice them, we don't realize them. We may even think we're right, but they're actually wrong. Because all of our afflictions, our mental afflictions, anger and attachment, these are all wrong conceptions. So among conceptions then, there are some that are correct, understanding an object as it is in a correct way, and there are some that are wrong, seeing an object in an incorrect way. And the same is true for perceptions. So our perceptions can sometimes be correct. Probably most of them are correct. So when we see green as green, we see rabbit ears as ears. But some perceptions can be wrong. Some people will look at green and they see it as red. I've heard that. But yeah, people who have color blindness, I think, they can see one color as something else. Or seeing rabbit's ears as horns. That's another very common example given in the teachings. Actually, rabbit's horns is an example of something non-existent, something that has no existence at all. It's complete fantasy. But it must have happened once upon a time that somebody saw a rabbit from far away with the ears sticking up in the air and thought, there were horns. Those are horns on the head of the rabbit. Look, there's a rabbit with horns. Maybe they had a bit too much to drink too, or something. But these things happen, yeah. We see something, and we don't see it correctly. We see it in a mistaken way. Yeah, there's lots of examples of that. Reflections in a mirror is another one. Even though we usually know that a reflection in a mirror isn't a real thing, but it can happen if we don't know there's a mirror there. I've had that experience. I remember walking into some kind of restaurant or coffee shop I'd never been before. And when I first walked in, I had this impression, it's huge. Wow, such a big place, so many tables. And then after a few seconds, I realized one whole wall was covered with mirrors and was just reflecting what was on the side of the wall. Yeah? Ever had that experience? Yeah, so sometimes you can be seeing what's a reflection in a mirror and not realize that it is a reflection in a mirror and be fooled into thinking, it's something real. So that's an example of a mistaken perception. Another one is seeing a mirage and thinking it's water. But I think even with the seeing, even without the thinking it's water, just the seeing itself, it looks like water. I mean, that's my experience when I've seen mirages. It really looks like water. Yeah. Sun and the hot surface are playing tricks on our eyes and causing this appearance, but it's not a drop of water there. It's totally dry. Also, I mean, they make these images that look so real, like dummies, mannequins, or I haven't actually been to a wax museum, but I've seen photos of the figures in a wax museum, and they look so real. So if you saw one of those figures, you could easily think it's the real thing.
In a lot of these examples, it seems like the eyes are working fine and the eye consciousness is working fine, and the mental consciousness is drawing the wrong conclusion. Like you see a rabbit's ears and you think that it's rabbit's horns, or you see a waxed mannequin and you're seeing all the details fine, the color and shape, but then your mental consciousness is drawing the wrong conclusion. Oh, that must be a person.
Yeah, I think in some cases it could be a problem with the mental consciousness, but it seems that in the text they do say that there can be causes for things to appear in a mistaken way, like the mirage. You have this situation where you have the hot sun, you have the dry ground, and that situation just causes this appearance of water. So it isn't just a mental consciousness, but there is actually something there coming to your eye consciousness. And if you don't know any better, you can think it's water, but there is a mistake even with the eye consciousness.
That one actually seems like to me like it's in the eye consciousness, just like seeing white snow on a mountain as blue.
Yeah, because they say there are sometimes factors within our body, like imbalance of the winds or excess bile. They use that example of seeing snow as yellow. If you have too much bile, it does appear yellow to you. And I was thinking too, when we're depressed, if you're really, really down, really, really depressed, things look kind of dark, gray, blue. I don't know. There's this expression, having the blues. I don't know if there's really some some truth to that things appear blue when you're depressed.
I worked with a person that had depression for many years, and when colors started to get dull and more grays and browns, that's when she would come in because she knew that she was kind of going down into a depression. So it was very palatable for her in her senses like that.
Mhm. Yeah, so there's actually a list. I can't remember the details, but there's a list of different factors that can cause misperceptions. Some of them are within ourselves, within our body, like I can't remember. But some of them are in external situations, like with the mirage. And another one they give is things appear to be moving even though they're not. Like if you're I've had this happen. If you're sitting on a train in the train station waiting for the train to move, and there's a train next to you, and you see movement, and you might think it's your train that's moving, but it's the other one, or the opposite. It may be the other train that's moving. I don't know. Anyway, but there seems to be movement of something, which is actually, I mean, they give the example of being in a boat on the water and thinking that the trees are moving. So anyway, that's the situation. That kind of mistake happens because of the situation. And then others are if you ingest certain types of substances in your body. We all know that one. Well, maybe not all, but some of us know that one. Then you can see things that aren't there, or things are distorted other than how they really are. Yeah, so there are different factors that can cause misperceptions, mistaken perceptions. Anyway, it's good to know. Good to know that some of our perceptions are correct and some are mistaken. And also our conceptions, some of them are correct and some of them are mistaken. Because, it's possible that somebody might think, I am always right. I never make a mistake. And they would never admit that maybe they misperceived something or, misunderstood something. So it's kind of humbling. It's humbling, I think. It's helpful as well, just to acknowledge there are things we need to do to work on ourselves, work on our mind, and not put the blame out there. The last bullet point on that slide says, mental afflictions such as anger, attachment, ignorance, and so forth are all examples of wrong conceptions. So that's why it is useful to know about wrong conceptions, know that they exist and how they work, why they're wrong, because that's what's happening whenever we get afflicted, when we get angry, or we have attachment, or we have ignorance. Our mind is under the influence of a wrong conception. So the next page, the next slide shows, this is a complicated topic and you may find it a bit too much, especially at this time of the day. In fact, let's skip it. Let's skip over this one. I don't think I want to go into it. We can go back to it tomorrow. That's actually the last slide, but I was thinking of talking more about how afflictions are wrong conceptions. So this chart shows different kinds of objects that appear to our mind or that are experienced by our mind. And this explains the difference between a wrong and a correct perception or conception. So the different kinds of objects, that's across the top of the chart. A focal object is also called observed object. So that's the object that's sort of out there, at least in the case of a perception. What's actually out there and the mind is, dealing with or referring to. And the second is the appearing object, and that's what's actually appearing to our mind. And it's not always the same as the focal object. There may be something out there, but what's appearing to your mind is something else, like the rabbit's horns. What's actually out there is just a rabbit with ears sticking up, but what's appearing to the person's mind is horns, rabbit horns. Yeah, so there could be a discrepancy between the focal object and the appearing object. And the third one is called the engaged object, which is what the mind is actually engaged in, dealing with. And then on the left-hand side, I put a few different possible experiences, instances of mind. Some are correct, some are wrong. So the first one is an eye consciousness apprehending green, seeing green, and seeing it as green and not as something else. And so in that case, green is all three objects. It's the focal object, it's what you're focusing on, it's what appears to your mind, and it's what your mind is engaged with. There's green, you see it as green, you're dealing with it as green. If you're looking for green cloth, you need to buy green cloth to make an altar for Tara, for example. So you see some green cloth and say, that's just perfect, just what I want. The second example is a wrong perception, an eye consciousness apprehending rabbit horns. So the focal object, what's actually out there, are rabbit ears sticking up. But what's appearing to the person are rabbit horns. Don't ask me why, but this person thinks or sees, I guess, horns instead of ears. So that's what appears to their mind, and that's also the engaged object. That's what they're engaging in, because they're thinking, wow, that's amazing. Look at that rabbit. It's got horns on its head. I've never seen such a thing before. I got to go and tell my friends, take a picture of it, whatever. So they're engaging with that. And that's a wrong consciousness. They're misperceiving, misunderstanding the object. Third one is a conceptual consciousness apprehending a rope. And so the focal object, observed object is a rope. There is a rope there. And they're thinking about it. So the appearing object is a mental image of a rope. So they have that mental image. And that's the engaged object is a rope. So they're engaging with a rope. If they want a rope to tie up a bundle of something, they're thinking, oh, there's a rope, just what I need. And they go for it. And the fourth one is a wrong conception. Conceptual consciousness apprehending a rope as a snake. So rope is the focal object, that's what's there. But what's appearing to their mind is snake, mental image of a snake. So there's a mental image in their mind, snake, and they're probably getting really scared and freaking out, running away. So snake is the engaged object. That's what their mind is engaging with and reacting to. So now let's look at an example that's perhaps more relevant to our experience. When we get angry, let's say there's a person named Joe, and we don't like Joe. There's things about Joe we don't like. Maybe that person, he's done things we don't like. Maybe he's actually hurt us. So we have aversion or anger towards Joe. So the focal object is Joe. And Joe is basically just a set of aggregates, body and mind, a whole collection of physical and mental components, and very impermanent, changing every single moment. All the atoms and molecules in their body are changing all the time. All the experiences in their mind are changing all the time. So there's nothing fixed and permanent there. But because of ignorance, that's another wrong conception that we have, we tend to see things as inherently existing. So Joe appears like an inherently existing person over there. And then because of certain things about Joe that we don't like, we're critical of, then anger and aversion comes up. And what happens with anger, the mind tends to focus on certain aspects of the person that we don't like, that we're judgmental or critical of. And then there's exaggeration. Those aspects become much bigger, kind of take over the whole person. So then Joe looks like 100% bad or stupid or an idiot or a jerk or whatever kind of words we use for people like that. So our mind then has this image, a mental image, and that's the appearing object. That's the appearing object. When we have anger towards Joe, that's a conceptual mind, because that's another thing too. Our afflictive emotions are always conceptual. They're never perception, they're conceptual. So there's this conceptual mind thinking about Joe, and what is appearing to our mind at that moment is bad Joe, or jerk Joe, idiot Joe, this awful person. Which isn't the same as the focal object. Joe's not a bad person from his own side. Maybe he has some bad qualities and he does make some mistakes sometimes. He's not perfect, but he probably has some good qualities too and does some good things. But we kind of ignore those and just focus on the bad stuff. So this is a bit like the conceptual consciousness apprehending a rope as a snake. Yeah, there's just a rope there. There's just Joe there, just this sentient being with mental and physical aggregates. But what is appearing to our mind is a jerk, an idiot, a snake, maybe. We use that word, don't we, sometimes for somebody we don't like, somebody we can't trust, like a snake. But yeah, so our image of Joe is not at all realistic. And yet, that's what we engage in. So that would be the engaged object. Bad Joe, jerk Joe, horrible Joe, despicable Joe. So this is what's happening when we're angry, when we have anger or aversion or irritation, dislike, any of those tones of anger in our mind towards another person. We're not dealing with the person as they are in a realistic way. We're dealing with them in a distorted way, seeing them incorrectly, and then engaging with that. And probably most people in the world have no idea that that's actually a wrong consciousness. Like seeing a rope as a snake. They probably believe, I know Joe, and he's like that, and you can't tell me otherwise. So they totally believe in what their mind is saying, and then even act on the basis of that. So this is how we get ourselves into trouble and create negative karma and just perpetuate our suffering. So I'm giving that example just to kind of make this more relevant, more practical to our experience. So anytime our mind gets caught up in an affliction like anger or attachment or jealousy, and also ignorance itself. This is what's going on. Our mind is not seeing accurately what is out there. Instead, we're seeing the object in a distorted way, in a mistaken way, other than how it is. But the good news is that these afflictions are not permanent, fixed parts of our mind. They are not in the nature of our mind. In the same way that heat is the nature of fire. You can't separate fire from heat. They come together inseparably. But that's not the case with the afflictions in our mind. It is possible to separate and remove the afflictions in the mind and be left with the mind, the clear, pure nature of the mind. But to be able to do that, it is important to understand the mind, its nature, and what aspects of mind are correct and helpful, and which ones are incorrect and harmful. I did want to talk more about mental and sense consciousnesses before answering those, so I'll do that tomorrow morning. Any short question before we stop? Yeah.
So one thing I think I'm stuck on here, if the visual consciousness is apprehending shape and color, how is the visual consciousness saying it sees rabbit horns? Doesn't that need to be the mental consciousness labeling a certain combination of shape and color to be rabbit horns?
It's a good question. It's like we were talking before, that with certain misperceptions, sometimes they do appear. I mean, I don't have this particular experience, but I do have the experience of a mirage, seeing a mirage and seeing it as water, you know. And I mean, I can't really tell. It's very difficult to tell if the idea of that being water is just the mental consciousness saying it's water, or if it's the visual consciousness. Because if our visual consciousness, they do say, if our visual, if our mind's very familiar with certain objects, we can know them just with our visual consciousness. There's certain things that our visual consciousness can know, even though it doesn't give a label, that's water. But knowing the characteristics of water, I'm not completely sure. But it seems that, yeah, just with our visual or any of our sense consciousnesses, it is possible to misperceive things and to have the impression, maybe not the thought, the idea, the label, but the impression that what you're seeing is something other than what it is. That's my understanding. But yeah, I'm not sure about that rabbit horns. That does seem a little far-fetched to say that that's the eye consciousness that's seeing rabbit horns. I don't know. I did take this from another chart that was bigger and had more different kinds of minds.
Are there practices to get in touch with that mental direct perception of an object before it turns into a conception? Because then you wouldn't have any afflictions ever.
I mean, that really short one, that
Yeah.
momentary one. Yeah, I think you have to be an Arya. Isn't that what they say? That because they call it's another. We're going to get into this tomorrow. The 7 types of awareness, but one of them is called inattentive perception, and that's when we have a perception, but our mind is not able to fully apprehend what's going on. So they say for an Arya, a person who's directly realized emptiness, there's no inattentive perceptions. They are able to know every single moment of mind. So an Arya has the ability to notice mental direct perceptions. Whether we can do it before we become an Arya, I don't know. Not sure. But if we have if you train your mindfulness, very, very, very strong mindfulness, you can probably become more and more aware of moments of experience.